Hi, everyone. You're coming right back? We have a quorum. So with the quorum being present, I'm going to call this meeting to order. The call is as follows. The Economic Development and University Relations Committee will conduct a public hearing to receive an update on the progress to date on the Retail Strategy Plan and Vacant Storefront Initiative. This hearing will be televised. I'd like to invite Adrian Musgrave from the Cambridge Local First to come and join us. I don't see anyone for public comment, but when folks show up, they can sign in and we'll get to public comment at the end of sometime during the agenda around 1. So we last met on this particular topic in September, and since then we've heard from the department on several matters, such as updates to the Vacant Storefront Initiative website, storefront activation resources, district assessments to highlight opportunities in the city's commercial areas, the Vacant Storefront Creative Design Contest, among other things. And it's clear that we're implementing key parts of the retail strategy plan. At the same time, many of us have been itching to put into place recommendations from the commercial land use classification study that was completed in July 2015, almost 4 years ago. We have a fast-changing business climate, and I hope today's discussion can be fruitful and we can walk out with a timetable for what has to happen to move the salient parts of the study recommendations forward. So I'm excited to hear about the outreach to business associations, the online survey to businesses, and the research staff has been doing. We'll start with introductions and then move to CDD's presentation and then open it up to discussion among the council. And as you'll see, there's an agenda for you. You'll have the presentation before you as well. We'll be talking about vacant storefront initiatives during the second half of the agenda. So with that, I will go around and please introduce yourself briefly. Thank you.
Quentin Zondervan, Cambridge City Councilor.
Lisa Hemmerly, Director of Economic Development.
Pardeep Safari, Senior Economic Development Manager.
Michael Monesteem, Executive Director, Central Square Business Association.
You could please come to the mic and introduce yourself. Thank you.
Sai Bedapalli, Membership Relations and Event Manager, Central Square Business Association.
Dennis Carlone, City Councilor.
And Councilor Mallon is here as well. And Jeff Roberts. How could I forget Jeff Roberts from zoning? So with that, I'll toss it over to your team for the presentation.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the council. So just really briefly to give a quick update on retail strategy implementation and then to leave obviously more time for land use and vacant storefront. We've been able to finish another district assessment for Inman Square. We finished Central Square last year, and we actually have plans to do Porter Square in fiscal year 2020. And those have been, I think, really helpful for our small business community. And we're going to talk more about the vacant storefront program in a little while. And we've instituted a construction mitigation pilot in both Inman and are starting in Harvard Square to help our small businesses manage some of the construction process as they go on so it's not affecting their business, or if it is affecting their business, how can the city help them in mitigating those issues. And we've also implemented a small business dashboard, which is a lot of information that businesses need to either run their business if they're currently there or even look to determine whether a particular neighborhood is a good place for them to relocate. We've actually increased in fiscal year 19 our Small Business Challenge grant program, and we can answer additional questions about the applicants that we've had this year. There's been no final decisions on that quite yet. And we're going to be having National Small Business Week in May, where we're going to be having events every day of that week, including some really good events for our small businesses around the neighborhood. So stand by for more on that. And we have decided to have our food truck pilot become a full-blown program, because it has been so successful, where we have about 76% of the operators are women or minority-owned business, and more than 50% are new businesses. And so we really are excited about that program and happy to talk more about that. But with that, I'm going to actually hand it over to Pardis and Jeff to talk about land use.
And I'd like to welcome Jason Elves from the East Cambridge Business Association.
Thank you. So through you, Madam Chair, thank you for having us. This is a great opportunity for us to respond to your policy order for asking for an update on the land use, retail land use initiative, as we're calling it. So Jeff and I will kind of present an overview of what we've been looking at. So just as a project background, as mentioned in the policy order, CDD did engage on a commercial land use classification study as to provide us some recommendations on the table of uses. And then in addition to that, through the retail strategic plan, our consultant recommended that the city incorporate those recommendations regarding retail in the classification study. So we've been doing some additional research, and current trends have shown, and this is nationwide, but especially here in Cambridge, that retailers are combining uses. So we've had a lot of interest in retailers combining classroom or education, retail and food uses, so maybe someone who's half cafe, half retail, retail and what we would consider craft manufacturing or maker space, so something like a microbrewery or some of our local chocolatiers, if you will. And then there's a large growth in small retail, you know, as we, not only local people, but visitors are looking for items that are locally made or considered artisanal products to that area. And again, just to reiterate, urban and makerspace manufacturing is growing nationwide. And most importantly, you know, a lot of retail spaces are coming online here at the city, whether that's Cambridge Crossing or other parts of the city, through new development. So why now? This provides us an opportunity, as the retail strategic plan indicated, and other small business feedback that we've been doing has shown, that we need to allow the zoning provide an opportunity to adapt to the changes that we've been seeing in the retail industry. We also want to provide with zoning new experiential retail and production spaces. And of course, we want to, this is an opportunity for us to help support local and retail identity, local entrepreneurship, and again, most importantly, address the retail strategic plan and other barriers that small businesses have been facing in the regulatory area. So recent efforts have shown that we've been doing kind of a different communication to our business association. So in addition to meeting one-on-one with Harvard Square Business Association, East Cambridge Business Association, and Cambridge Local First, we did an online survey to businesses, and we also conducted our own research of BZA cases in the past 8 years, and looking for some commonality in the cases involving retail or small business owners. So the specific issues we heard and found through our research is that the current use table is complicated to read. There's too many footnotes, many different categories, and as we mentioned previously, some of the definitions are not kind of up to date to what current retail has been asking for. We also heard a lot that over the past couple of years, but especially in the survey, that food entrepreneurs are facing more difficulties because there's no like commercial kitchen or especially the fast order food requirement. They occasionally, business owners have found that there's too much time resolving zoning issues, and this may be because the definitions are not clear to them, or they're not sure where their type of business fits into the current table of uses. Parking requirements in certain types of retail uses have been a hindrance for some businesses, non-conforming uses. And then again, that idea of the mix of types of retail. So business owners said that they're not able to do, for example, the retail and the educational under the current zoning. And then some folks mentioned that some neighborhoods have been objecting to the different types of commercial uses that they would like to see in their district. So in their 8-year review of the BZA requests, these were the most common ones we found for small business owners. So again, the parking requirements for their type of business, fast order food permits, variances for the non-defined uses that are currently in the table or the mix of uses. Some uses are just not clearly defined, and so that was why some business owners had to go to BZA. We surveyed some of these business owners who had to go through these requests, and some of them were able to share with us some of the time and cost it took to go through a special permit or variance. And on average, that was about $3,000. And then the average time for a special permit or variance, and this is a legal process per the statute, the state, takes about 3 to 6 months. So now I'm going to hand it over to Jeff Roberts, who's going to discuss our recommendations based on the research we found.
Hi, Jeff Roberts with Zoning and Development. I'm happy to be back here at this committee. I'm starting to feel like a regular with this committee, which is nice. We've been thinking about this issue for a long time, and the work that Pardees was just describing, I think, has been really helpful for us in trying to tighten up our thinking around a specific set of recommendations that we hope or something can be move forward in the short term. So just to give just an overview, and I'm going to talk about these more in detail, there are some recommendations that have to do with just kind of trying to resolve and clean up some of the confusion that makes our current ordinance a little bit inaccessible to business owners. And then looking towards some improvements that anticipate or that help fill in some of the use types, some of the undefined uses that Pardees mentioned, trying to help look forward to unanticipated kind of uses that might be unanticipated at this time. And then really the last part is the one that probably requires some, the most discussion with council, is where do we have requirements that have been of particularly burdensome to small businesses that we might think about alternative approaches. So the first part of it really is taking what we have now in the zoning ordinance, which has some uses that are defined, some uses that are not defined, lots of footnotes that qualify and clarify different categorizations of uses, and trying to put some consistency in place so that everything has a definition. We're cleaning up the footnotes as much as we can. This is really not particularly sexy, but it's probably the most one of the most challenging parts of this effort, because this is a zoning ordinance that was built over a long period of time. There are uses that have been permitted under the current ordinance that have special permits and variances. Trying to change the fundamental roots of the ordinance can lead to potentially unforeseen consequences. So it's something we have to really be careful and thoughtful about. The second part, we're looking at use types that are much more common in the city now than they maybe were in 1961 when our table of uses was put in place. So some of the things that we've been talking about include grocery stores, actually not a defined or separated use in our table. In terms of food uses, Pardees talked a little bit about the fast order food ordinance, which we'll get back to a little bit. But one of the things that's been one of the complications with that has been when we have very small food-oriented uses, food stands, they tend to get caught under the regulations that were put in place for more substantial fast order food establishments. So we're looking at can we separate out and create definitions for those smaller kinds of food operations. Performing arts is something that's come up. This, of course, connects to some work that we've been doing in other areas as well. Fitness centers are the ones that probably the biggest head scratcher of why we have no place for fitness centers in our zoning ordinance, and we are seeing a lot of them of various types. Outdoor uses are tricky. Our zoning ordinance is tends to be more restrictive about outdoor retail uses, but the uses that are listed currently include things like drive-in establishments and other automobile-oriented things, car washes, things that we're not seeing quite as much of, but we are seeing a lot more outdoor retail sales, outdoor recreation, entertainment. So we're trying to look at places to put that in our zoning ordinance, and temporary open-air markets. Farmers markets are something that are currently not defined. Temporary uses are particularly interesting. I just about an hour before the meeting, I got this memo which from American Planning Association, which talks about the increasing importance of having regulations for temporary uses in cities. These sort of hybrid activities that Parties was talking about, our zoning ordinance keeps every use separate, so it's sometimes hard to define when you have, say, a retail store where it's also offering instructional classes or services as part of that. So we're looking at ways within the definitions of the uses first to clarify what's allowed with a particular kind of retail establishment. And also we're looking at establishing some specific kind of hybrid use types, in particular for facilities that include retail sales as well as production, so places that are sort of making and selling products in the same establishment, as well as food service and production. So uses that we're basically taking activities that might otherwise be considered part of our industrial use categories and clarifying that there are some instances where that a combined production and retail or service facility can fall under a different use category. This is really an important one. So we don't have in our current zoning ordinance any provision that creates kind of a catch-all for a retail business that is not otherwise specifically listed. And the way our current zoning ordinance works, if the use isn't listed, it's considered not allowed anywhere in the city, so any such use requires a variance. So what we're looking at doing now is creating a definition, a general definition for retail establishments, which we don't have a definition of what a retail establishment means in general. So we're looking to create one and to have regulations for retail establishments that are not otherwise defined in the zoning ordinance. And the way those would be treated would be, we would, in retail use districts, we might create a special permit provision so that instead of needing a variance, those uses, if they fall under the general retail definition, could seek a special permit. We can talk a little bit more about, I think maybe everyone's familiar with the sort of difference between a variance and a special permit, but it's something we can certainly talk about if we feel like that makes sense. And then the last part, so some of the things that we're thinking about are based on the results of the outreach and the surveys that Parties mentioned, and research on typical impediments. Many businesses run into this issue of needing a parking waiver, and this happens because you have an existing building where you're trying to put a new retail use in that building. The retail use maybe requires more parking spaces than the existing use or the use that preceded it in that space. And when that happens, it triggers a parking requirement. And we currently have a zoning exemption that says if the business only requires up to 4 spaces, that those can be waived. But in many cases, businesses require more than 4 spaces, especially for restaurant type uses. Sort of as an illustration, there are some districts where a restaurant use is required to have 1 parking space for every 5 seats. So if you do the math on that, it means any restaurant that has more than 20 seats exceeds the exemption. And so we've actually seen a bunch of cases, and if you've been following it, you've probably seen a bunch of cases where a business wants to add, it's sort of stuck at 20 seats, and if it wants to add more, they're going to the BZA for a parking waiver. So we're recommending looking at that and really expanding that waiver. And we think that if we create a broader exemption for new retail uses within an existing building, within some limitations, not up to 10,000 square feet, so keeping the retail fairly small, we could expand the waiver, and a lot fewer businesses would need to come to the BZA for those parking, and those are special permits, and it would be moving from a special permit to an as of right allowance. So the second row has to do with an issue that's come up many times over the years of non-conforming uses. So there are lots of places in the city where there are residential areas or other mixed-use areas that for one reason or another don't allow retail uses, or they don't allow particular kinds of retail uses, which then require variances. There are potential approaches where we could consider a range of retail uses that we think would be appropriate, either within certain size limitations, certain use limitations, or other conditions that could be allowed by special permit with conditions, as opposed to needing a variance. So again, that wouldn't it would mean that they would still have to go through some level of review, but it would be a different type of process and a more kind of predictable and straightforward process than a variance. And then the last piece, if you look at our zoning ordinance, there are many small business types, especially some of the types that have been identified in the retail strategy as retail uses that are seeing a sort of stronger future in the city compared to some other retail uses that are not as easy to make viable, that are much more heavily restricted than others. So if you look at theaters, dance halls and entertainment venues, commercial recreation, fast order food, and even for some reason veterinary establishments, they're more, the zoning for those are more restrictive than for more typical retail stores or restaurants or other uses. So that is more of a kind of a policy question, I think, for the council to consider, whether it makes sense to be more permissive for those kinds of retail uses, or to consider some alternative approaches to regulating them. But it's certainly something that should be looked at if the goal is to try to make zoning a little bit more straightforward for small businesses. So that's where we're going to leave it, and we're happy to answer any questions or to sort of take comments or get feedback about these key questions of really what a lot of this comes down to is a balance between having the right set of regulations in place to deal with potential impacts, and then to be more and how much to be permissive and supportive of retail, different kinds of retail and small business uses in the city.
Thank you, Jeff. I'd like to welcome David Marr from Cambridge Commerce. So thank you for coming. I know that I saw a hand up over here from Councillor Zondervan as a clarifying question. Would you like to ask that?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. And through you to Mr. Roberts. Could you give us a little bit of a sense of how specific we need to be and why in terms of different types of retail? So does our zoning ordinance need to distinguish between a bookstore and a music shop? And if so, why?
Through you, Madam Chair, excellent question. And we didn't, I guess I would have been helpful if we sort of brought the document that everyone could look at. But the way that we break down uses within the retail section of the ordinance, it doesn't separate, say, bookstores from music stores. It doesn't really, so retail stores, if you're selling goods, are one particular type of use. But where it breaks apart different uses are where just the nature of the activity that's going on is different. So for instance, a retail store is different from a restaurant, which is in turn different from a theater, which is in turn different from a funeral home, which is, different from which is different, from an art studio. So those are really where the differences are come into play, is when the kind of activity going on within the establishment is different rather than specifically what's being sold. I think the one area where it's a little, it's a little tricky, and we've pointed this out in the past, is where we have food service uses, food-related uses break down a little bit more specifically. You have restaurants. You have there's separate categories for restaurants that serve alcohol versus restaurants that don't serve alcohol. Although when you actually look at the regulations, we regulate them all the same. So I'm not really sure why they're broken out as different use categories. An establishment that is a bar that serves alcohol but not food is a separate kind of establishment. And then we have our fast order food establishments, which are defined in a much more complex way, where it depends. It's a type of food service use that depends on the kind of seating that's available at the establishment, the availability or not availability of menus for seated patrons, the amount of eat-in business versus takeout business is one of the criteria, and the availability of how the food is being served, is being served on disposable versus non-disposable plates and serving utensils. So that's basically how they break down. And I think the reason, the rationale for it, I can't really speak to what people were thinking in 1961, but I think a lot of it has to do with transportation impacts, traffic impacts. How many people are expected to be visiting an establishment at any given point in time. So for each of these uses, the parking requirements are somewhat different. The use requirements the use regulations are somewhat different, in that the businesses that tend to have a higher intensity of use, like say a theater, which might have a lot of people coming in, lots of people coming in at particular points in time. Those tend to be allowed more in our central business areas and less so in our sort of more neighborhood oriented business areas. So I think hopefully that gives a little bit of an impression of how it breaks down.
Yes.
Thank you. That was very helpful. Just theoretically, would it be possible to change that so that we're regulating the businesses based on those specific constraints that you mentioned, like how many people are expected, which might be correlated with the size of the business, rather than with what type of business it is? Because a lot of the other constraints are already regulated, right? So a restaurant has to obey all kinds of other regulations in order to serve food. A liquor store has to have a separate liquor license and so forth and so on. So, would it be theoretically possible to achieve the same goal without restricting it by business type, and instead by how many people are actually going to frequent the business, essentially?
Through you, Madam Chair, in theory, yes. In practice, it's a little bit difficult because zoning sort of works in broad strokes. So it deals with kind of the bigger picture issues of what kinds of uses are allowed. If we were to try to get more specific about what what the number of people that were frequenting an establishment, or certainly the size of the establishment in terms of square footage is something that's relatively straightforward to regulate in zoning. But looking at attendance or traffic in and out, it's very difficult to make those determinations when you're in the process of actually permitting a use, or granting a certificate of occupancy for that use. So we've found over time that in the fast order food issue as an example, we found it's difficult when there are performance measures that determine whether a particular use is allowed or not. It can be very hard to regulate because we don't really know in advance what a particular business could be generating in terms of traffic.
So before we get to some other conversation from my colleagues, I wanted to bring up a point about commercial activity on residential lots. So this is probably best under, I'm thinking number 2, add use types that are not listed. I think about home-based businesses, and the reality now that given how expensive it is to rent a place, that there's web developers, there's small tech businesses of 2 or 3 people operating from their homes, and that's not necessarily delineated in our zoning. So it's not called out here, but I'm sure, and I don't know how often people get caught, but I think if we were to say web companies and these companies that are very much really common today are part of our our retail environment, then I think perhaps it just is clearer, and we could add that to the zoning. So that's just a quick point. It wasn't called out, but I remember reading about it in the land classification study.
Madam Chair, in response to that, so we didn't really include it in the scope of this presentation, but the zoning ordinance does have provisions for what's called customary home occupations. So an office type use, a home office of an office worker, and even a professional like a doctor or an attorney or someone of that type is allowed in the zoning ordinance. And there's
I know that. I think I'm
so
just
we
saying
could,
that it's to allow it. It doesn't count for the full range of businesses.
Right. So we could certainly include looking at that. We could provide information about what the current rules are for home occupations, and if there's thinking about amending those requirements, that's something that we could look into.
Great. That's just a comment that I was thinking about. So you have discussion questions on the page. What other zoning amendments might small businesses face? Are there issues, concerns with proposed new use types? How much should existing requirements be relaxed? So I want to open up those questions to my colleagues, representatives from business associations, and see if they have any comments. Councillor Mallon.
Oh, thank you. I had a clarifying question from before. And first, I just wanted to say I'm glad we're having this conversation. I know we had Councillor Siddiqui and Councillor Simmons and I had filed a policy order in December to kind of move this part of zoning forward, because we all have a story that we can tell about a retail establishment that just did not fit into the table of uses, and the length of time that it took them to work through the process was lengthy and costly. So I'm a little bit geeking out right now because I'm obsessed with this 2015 study of the classification of land uses, and especially since we just had our conversation last Thursday night around zoning and the arts, and so I think this conversation is really timely. I did have one question that with my arts task force hat on that was in the commercial land use study that I didn't hear you guys call out, which was around live entertainment and allowing live entertainment or commercial recreation through licensing instead of zoning to allow for greater provision of cultural activities and entertainment with more frequent oversight via licensing to manage impacts. And I wasn't sure if it just wasn't called out here and you were thinking about it, or if it's not going to be part of what we do pushing this forward. So if you could just clarify.
Thanks through you, Madam Chair. It's a good question. I think it really relates to the number 3 sort of on our list. Where was it? Number 3? I've already forgotten which the numbers are. Number 5. The very last part where we talk about so entertainment uses are among the uses that tend to be more heavily restricted in our zoning ordinance. So you could look at it as a issue of how do we define and classify those uses, but fundamentally it's a question of how strictly do we want to regulate them, and so that really is a policy question for council, whether we should look at how restrictive we are towards those kinds of uses and consider making it less restrictive. It's actually it's a sort of a more straightforward question from a technical zoning standpoint, but maybe a more complex and nuanced question from a policy standpoint. There may be some areas where we could either further kind of clarify or add nuance to the definitions of those kinds of uses. But generally speaking, we have theater uses, we have a category of uses where, for basically places where food or drinks are provided and where dancing or entertainment is also provided, which is a more in the zoning is more restrictive towards those types of uses, which encompass things like nightclubs and dance halls. If there are other kind of categories we want to create, or other areas where we want to allow for more either more temporary kind of entertainment or entertainment that's not at the same kind of intensity of use as a nightclub or a dance hall, we could think about ways to create those definitions. But again, the other approach could be to think about, do we want to be more permissive?
Thank you. Well, our next Arts Task Force meeting is about permitting and licensing, so I think it would be good to have that context. And one of the things that the Vice Mayor and I have been talking about is acoustic music and how that's licensed and how that's classified, so that's something to think about as well. And then, I feel like you guys did a great job covering what the major points were in the 2015 study, but I'm curious around timeline and how soon we could actually see this come to fruition. I know that you're a very busy department, but I do feel like this has been on the radar since 2015, and it would be great to kind of fast track this as we indicated in December, but I don't really know the timeline. If you could just speak to that a little bit, anyone.
And sorry to interrupt, thank you for that question. Just to add on, I think that the study discussed approaches, right? This comprehensive view. And so maybe you could speak to that in answering Councilor Mallon's question.
Sure, Madam Chair. Just to start with that question, I think what we're looking at is what's in that study was talked about as a targeted approach to say what are some specific improvements that we could implement that would not require a kind of a more comprehensive revision to our zoning code, which would take a lot longer. In terms of timeline, this is sort of the way I think about it. So we have a set of in my shop, we have a set of zoning projects that we're working on right now, including updates to the green building requirements. We're looking at affordable housing in response to some policy orders that were brought our way by council, and we're looking at this this item of retail land use, in addition to the ongoing process that we have to look at climate change, resilience, and zoning standards to address the work that's been done so far on that, which is a process that we hope will have recommendations by around the end of the year. In addition to that, we have there I think currently 4 zoning petitions that are still under consideration, including the accessory apartments zoning petition from the City Council. There's the Alexandria Grand Junction overlay proposal, which is still has been continued, and then there are 2 sort of newer zoning petitions that are under review. So it's a pretty busy year, and I think between the just the amount of items that we have and the sort of the complication of working on projects like this, which is that it's not a perfectly linear process of saying, well, we need a week to do this and a week to do that and a week to do that. It's it requires much more sort of thinking through complicated issues, some of which have easy solutions that we can identify and then move forward. Some issues are much more complicated and require a lot more thought as to how we can address them from a zoning and legal standpoint. It's very difficult to set a specific timeline, but what I would say is that this is among the projects that we're actively working on this year. My hope is that we would be able to have something to come before the council sometime in the middle of the year. But it's difficult to give a definite timeline. That's a timeline that could easily shift depending on other zoning priorities, other zoning matters that are being looked at by the council, as well as sort of the unpredictability of petitions that might come from outside of our department, from outside of the city, that would nevertheless need to be studied and addressed. So it's a long answer, but it's the most honest answer that I have at this point.
It seems like a big capacity issue. We need a few more Jeffs, it seems like. So, I think it's clear that this work has been a goal of the council for many years. I think the worry from us as a committee, as a council, is many of the businesses have been waiting, right? They have been waiting, and the more time that goes on, you hear about another variance, you hear about another $5,000-6,000 that's being spent, and you hear about other lost opportunities. So it is this tension. I think I speak for many of us that this is a top priority, and we have to think about talking to the city manager about more capacity, because this is it's 2005. It's going to be 4. It's going to be 4 years in July, and there's the study. And I apologize. I should have. It's a long study, so I didn't want to print 100 pages of it. But it really does an excellent job of telling us the small things that we can do, the big things that we can do. And so that's my spiel before I hand it out to. I wanted to welcome the mayor as well. Thank you for being here, Councilor Zondervan.
Thank you.
Oh, I apologize. How dare me. Councilor Carlone has not spoken. Please.
Thank you both. Lisa and Pardis, the outreach to business associations and the feedback you've gotten, are there reports on that? Are there summaries that are on the web or?
Through you, Madam Chair, there are summaries that we provided. Basically, the summaries are the bullet points in the first part of the presentation, but we can make the summary available online.
I just think it'd be interesting to see how each district differs and what the priorities are. As part of that, is it helpful to have neighborhood surveys of what's needed, what the neighbors say is needed as a use in each of the, especially the neighborhood centers? I know maybe 30 years ago, Central Square did that, and at that time it said more clothes, bakeries, and one other item, maybe people present, I'm looking at the former mayor, remembers what that was. And some clothing shops did show up, some didn't succeed. Some bakeries came, some didn't succeed, but some did and are still around. Does that help at all in the mix for landowners to say, well, my neighborhood, Evergood, people still pine for Evergood. And so everybody says we need that little grocery store back. But is that kind of helpful for your department?
Through you, Madam Chair. So our commercial district assessments provide that information. We survey people actually on the street that are using the square to get that information. So in regards to your note about Central Square, you were probably referring to our, what we used to do is our intercept studies. We have them for all the major districts. Those are already posted and available online. And now what we're doing is, with the district assessments, is combining that data with additional data, to provide maybe a more, robust picture of the district. So we do have that information.
Fantastic. Jeff, I just looked up zoning and I couldn't find the sexy parts. Is there a specific section that I should be looking at? But more seriously, on the specific issues heard, neighborhood objections about, with some uses about noise, traffic, parking, I would add the word exhaust. Wood, fire, smoke really impacted people in my neighborhood for a while. And some sites like One Kendall Square, the smoke barbecue works because neighboring houses are a good distance away. So I realize that is an issue that probably should be included. And I thought it was excellent to consider relaxing some requirements, number 5, and some small businesses are more heavily restricted. How do we allow them to occur? And you mentioned a special permit, which I concur with, I agree. Are you going to list criteria as eventually as part of that? It just seems to me potential nuisance. Does that use support existing land uses, meaning not residential as much as retail next to it or office next to it? Will there be criteria? Or if not, I think there can be general criteria. Is that true? That would be helpful for the planning board or BZA?
Yeah, through you, Madam Chair, just to back up a little bit about so everyone's sort of on the same page with the difference between special permits and variances. Special permits so the process is kind of similar in terms of going through a review, having a public hearing, having a decision be filed. So one of the things that doesn't really change between a special permit and a variance is the timing. But in terms of the outcomes, a variance is something that is generally assumed to not be granted unless there's a compelling reason specific to that site that justifies granting it. And a special permit is like the opposite. It says it's assumed that it would be granted unless there's a compelling reason specific to that site why it wouldn't be granted. So a special permit does rely on having the zoning requirements be clear, and also having some criteria in place that say what are the instances under which the board that's granting the special permit might consider not granting it, and those could include issues of nuisance and noise. We do currently have general special permit criteria. So even without new criteria, special permits are subject to a set of general criteria, which essentially say that special permits will normally be granted unless there's a factor specific to that site, or unless there's a specific reason why it shouldn't be granted due to, nuisance or hazard, due to change in traffic circulation or significant changes in traffic circulation that would have a negative impact. Via the divergence from the city's urban design standards. Those are the kinds of things that could be, under the general special permit criteria, could be grounds for not granting a special permit.
I would hope we start doing proactive things like indeed would support surrounding retail uses. We all know about theaters helping restaurants. That's the easiest one, or not having a theater and hurting restaurants. There are positive reactions with many of these uses that are being discussed that I think heighten why it's a positive addition. Thanks. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councillor Zondervan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you, so personally, I believe we should be as least restrictive as possible. So I would really urge you to help us understand how we can do that, and whether we could indeed maybe restructure this so that it's based on the size of the business more so than the type of the business. I understand that we may not be able to get all the way there, but there might be opportunities to consolidate some of that complexity away. And then similarly on parking, which I'm renaming car storage, my personal preference is that we eliminate all car storage requirements. But again, I understand that may not be possible. So could you give us some guidance on what kinds of current parking requirements could we consider eliminating without expecting major negative consequences?
Sure. On that last question, through you, Madam Chair. So, as parties pointed out, probably the number one BZA request for businesses, for new businesses, is parking, a special permit to waive parking. And what ends up happening, this is at least the way I look at it, you have an existing building, you have a new retail use that comes into that space. It triggers a parking requirement, but from a practical point of view, we don't want people to be tearing away parts of buildings to add off-street parking spaces. It's really not, in many of those cases, it's not practical to actually provide the parking spaces that are required. So it's effectively forcing those businesses in front of the BZA to seek a special permit. And that's the kind of situation that's it's really difficult for the city. It's a difficult position for the city to be in, to say, well, we don't want you to make some significant alterations to this building in order to provide parking, but we're going to create kind of a disincentive by making you have to go to the BZA. And the BZA, I think, generally speaking, tends to grant those variances. I think for exactly that reason. What's the alternative I'm sorry, not a variance, special permit. What's the alternative to granting that special permit? So I think that's an instance where, I think any instance where you're creating a new business in an existing space where it would be impractical to create new parking, it makes a lot of sense to not require it. Other situations, I think, are we'd have to think about a little bit more carefully. If you're building a new building that has retail uses in it, is that a situation where we'd want to waive parking or not waive parking? It might depend on the characteristics of the use. So that would be a situation where there would be a lot more questions to answer. But I think where you have an existing building and where our planning, our general planning objectives wouldn't encourage the creation of new parking spaces because it would be sort of damaging to the existing built environment. Those are situations where we shouldn't disincentivize.
Thank you. I really like that answer. So how quickly or easily could we change that? Because that sounds like a relatively straightforward change. I might be misconstruing it, but I'm hoping that that's essentially striking a few sentences in the zoning ordinance.
Through you, Madam Chair, it might be more complicated than that, but I agree. I don't think it would be. I don't think it would be that difficult. But it, like with anything in zoning, we'd have to figure out the right approach. That wouldn't. We have to think about what unintended consequences there might be. We would have to, make sure that that legally speaking, it's an appropriate exercise. So it still takes some time just to get through the technical aspect of it. But if it's something that the city council, as a policy matter, favored doing, then that makes that part of the process a bit quicker.
Yeah, I think there are a few things that I've heard from my colleagues that I think we would probably prioritize and push. So I saw Ms. Musgrave's hand up, so I wanted to give you the mic.
Thanks. Hi, we really appreciate this. As many have noted, there have been a really good plan on the books to look into since 2015, and a lot of our local business owners work really hard to get up and running, and these are significant roadblocks, so we're really excited to be able to partner with economic development and the zoning department to do this, and we've had some really good conversations and partnerships in making that possible. One thing that I just want to highlight is when we talked about this, we always ask, what are other places doing? And it's very clear that Cambridge is leading the way on this, and there aren't a lot of other cities out there that are trying to wrangle, in some cases, 50-year-old zoning. So we're really excited, and we understand that it's a complex and complicated endeavor. Madam Chair, Councilor Siddiqui, we're really happy that you noted about the home-based businesses, not just on the professional services side, but on the maker side. Either if you're making, small batch manufacturing through 3D printing, or if you are, in particular, kind of a home-based chef. In Somerville, they have this possibility, and it creates a lot of opportunities for local entrepreneurs, and we feel like Cambridge has an opportunity to grow that local entrepreneurship sector in that way as well. We're also happy to learn more about this temporary use zoning, given that that's a way for folks to dabble in local entrepreneurship without betting their house. So we're excited to see more about what that might come from. And we have two questions. One of the other impediments around zoning is just the advising that a local business owner would receive. And I think that's been really tough because a local business owner will come and say, I do something really standard. This is really common. I should just be able to go through a standard process. And then when they're told later that they have to go up for a special permit or for a variance. I was wondering if, knowing that this is going to take a long time, if we could change something now as far as the advising that we get to local business owners to say, okay, if this is what you're doing, you know that you're either going to have to go through this process or you're not going to have to go through this process, and they get something that's ideally written and that they can rely on to move forward with their business plan. So that's our one question. And then I'll just list the second one if that's easier. We were also wondering, given the changing nature of retail in particular, the thoughts around non-retail use for ground floor spaces. And I would just love to hear any thoughts or comments that you would have on that concept. Thank you.
Through you, Madam Chair, I'll try to do the first one and maybe turn it over for the second one. I think part of the goal of this effort is to address this issue of making it clearer to businesses from the start of the process, what category they fall into and where they and what the permitting process is going to be from a zoning standpoint moving forward. I think we talk about this a lot, internally with other departments. And we can continue to talk about the issue, but fundamentally, when someone proposes something, even though it may feel very straightforward, it has to be looked at in the context of what's in our zoning ordinance. And if the zoning ordinance is either unclear about something, or sometimes it results in kind of a surprise where someone doesn't think they fall into a particular use. They don't think of themselves as a particular use, but when you actually read the zoning ordinance and you read the definitions, it turns out it does. That's what creates that issue. So I think that I do think it makes sense that if there is a change that's successful and that helps to resolve some of the ambiguity about how different kinds of retail uses are defined, along with that, there might be some information that gets provided that helps to provide a little bit more advice and explanation, to go along with the text of the ordinance itself. Sometimes when we put new zoning in place, we'll work to create guidelines to help sort of illustrate and provide for a more user-friendly way for people to read and understand what's in it.
Sure.
I was just wondering, so I guess my question is around the interpretation and the advising component. We think that updating the zoning will do a huge difference, but until that happens, and even when that happens, there still is going to need to be advice given. And if that could happen earlier in the process and more transparently, that would help our business owners understand and feel confident that they're going through a process that they can handle and that they've budgeted for. And I was just wondering if there would be a possibility to see how that process currently works and to perhaps update that in the meantime as far as the advice that's given and the interpretation that's given. There's clearly, if grocery stores and fitness centers are not in there, we know that there's going to be surprises for what's obvious and what's not. But I think moving that advice earlier in the process would do a lot, especially in this interim phase.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So in Pardeesa's wonderful new role as senior manager, she's also the small business liaison. And we invite all of our small businesses to reach out to her to make sure that, and to anybody in Economic Development Division, to make sure that, we're there, that they know that we're there to walk them through the process, that they don't have to go to, a whole bunch of different people. They can go to one of us and we can help walk them, excuse me, through the permitting process in the city so that they're aware of the steps that they have to go to. We also have steps to starting your business online and it also available in multiple languages. We're certainly able to, offer a variety of technical assistance and always have an economic development. And part of Pardeesa's new role is to work with the various departments and divisions throughout the city, to find if there are any kind of catch points that are making it harder for businesses to get through a process. And I think that's part of the catharsis of the land use table effort, is to make sure that we're kind of smoothing that process out. And then to just get to your question about non-retail uses on the ground floor, I think we have this discussion kind of theoretically a lot, and we're not big fans of having non-retail uses unless it's an active use, And we face that with banks, and we face that with daycares, which I love, but I don't find them the most active uses. However, as a necessary component of drop-off and pickup, they need to be at street level. And so how do we kind of manage that process without having windows open to children on the first floor? So we are thinking through, kind of, what the pressure of non-retail on ground level means. The good news for Cambridge is that there's so much pressure right now for retail in general that, we're not really seeing as many non-retail uses on the ground floor, but making sure that, and that's part of the vacant storefront discussion too, is, how do you make sure that spaces are active, from a pedestrian standpoint?
And just to the point about how to start a business and so forth, I think I'd raised this in a public safety committee hearing, but with the advent of the online permitting, I mentioned that some of the guides are from when Richard Rossi was city manager. So I think an update at some point would be helpful. Has it been updated?
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe there's an old version that I had found, but that's great that it's updated. But I think to your point of the communication, if there are, a list of ways that Cambridge Local First and other businesses have advice on this small, business liaison and how to make that tighter, I think our staff would definitely be open to those recommendations. So thank you for the questions. Jason, would you like to go?
I'm wondering, so zoning and the table uses is one level of kind of like authority that can sort of say who goes into what spaces.
Jason, could you please use the mic?
Sure.
Thank you.
And so what other departments will be able to kind of chime in once these uses are allowed, and what kind of regulatory role can they play? So I'm just trying to think of a couple examples. On Cambridge Street, we have someone that went and got a license for live entertainment, but then the license commission was able to dictate what that meant for them. So there's someone on Cambridge Street that can only have 2 people playing at the same time, non-amplified, which eliminates, they can't bring in an Irish session band, which is something that they were doing on a Sunday. So I guess once some of these uses are allowed, are there other departments that can have a say over and kind of manage what happens? I guess it's a similar question about inspectional services when it comes to health inspections. What can, if you allow, I think on here was like about like food incubator spaces, like if a restaurant kind of rent out their space, is there another layer of regulation that inspectional service will have over that won't allow that, even if we make it allowed in the zoning? I have a couple of other questions, but I don't know. I guess it's always a balance, right? Like we want more businesses to be able to open up with ease, as opposed to having to go to some of these boards and then having contentious conversations with maybe a butter. So if we're trying to avoid that, and this is still a zoning thing that has to go through the council, so if the council may or may not want to give up some of those layers of control, I'm trying to think about where's the balance in all this? Because something else we brought up was, has there been any look at relaxing some of the restrictions for existing commercial spaces in the C1 district? So Hampshire Street is a C1 residential. Anybody that wants to open up on one of the many spaces on Hampshire Street has to go for at least a variance. I don't know if they need a special permit or not. And I think one of the answers I got on that was, well, we want to make sure that the residents are able to have a say over what business goes into a certain space. Is there any way that we can look at relaxing some of those in the C1 in this process, but still, you know what I'm trying to say?
Jeff?
Sure, Madam Chair. Just I'll quickly note that what we're talking about is zoning, which is land use regulation. It's what's allowed in a particular area relative to what what's generally allowed in the zoning district or what's generally around it, and it doesn't cover other regulations that would apply. You know, the License Commission has jurisdiction over licensing. It's a completely separate process, except that one of the tricks and one of the potential kind of snags is that a license commission is only going to look at licensing an establishment if it's allowed by zoning. So, you know, by making things more permissive in zoning, or by, you know, taking care of some of the limitations, it means that more businesses can you know, make it to that licensing step, but it doesn't necessarily say that it doesn't necessarily control what kinds of conditions or limitations the license commission might put on a particular business.
There shouldn't be a fear that this is like a free-ranging change that means that, you know, a rock club's going to move on to Hampshire Street and no one's going to have any say over it. There's still other layers of sort of protection for the community, right?
Yeah, that's correct. The license commission, it wouldn't supersede any authority of the license commission. And in terms of other codes, you know, obviously there's health codes, building codes that are applicable at the state level. There are federal codes having to do with accessibility. All of those would continue to apply. Those would not be superseded by zone. Those codes wouldn't be superseded by zoning. And then the second question, I think, gets to one of the points in this presentation about are there places to be more flexible about what's allowed in certain districts. We've actually spent over the years. I've spent some time looking in particular neighborhoods at this question of, you know, where you have existing retail uses in residentially zoned areas, is there an interest in making the requirements more flexible so that you could have things, for instance, allowed by special permit? In the past, I've heard, I think we've received a lot of pushback to that idea. I could say sort of candidly, neighborhoods have not always embraced that idea. I think because of what you mentioned, because people feel like the variance process affords neighbors a level of control that can help to prevent circumstances that they would find undesirable. So that's something that's been an issue, but I think it's continued to be a topic of discussion and can certainly continue to be a topic of discussion here, and something that we can bring forward some potential approaches for the council to consider. But again, just candidly, it's something that we've heard opinions on both sides of the issue. So it's hard to come to a clear conclusion about what we would recommend.
It's a good question.
I do have another question.
Yeah, please.
One of the recommendations is exempting new parking requirements for any new retail use up to 10,000 square feet in an existing building, changing it from the small business exemption of up to 4 spaces. 10,000 seems kind of high. I'm not sure. So if this goes from a small business exemption, I guess what's the definition? Like, how do you guys determine what a small business is versus then jumping to a 10,000 square foot? And I guess I'm just trying to think of who this relief ends up being for. Like, if we're trying to give the relief to the small business owner, I'm just trying to think of what a 10,000 square foot user looks like and where that number came from. Is my question.
Sure,
Exactly.
Madam Chair. So I think that's one of the difficult things about this study is that the reality is, depending on the type of business, the size range can vary quite a bit. I think with 10,000 square feet, it's a bit of an arbitrary number, but I think for uses that are less than 10,000 square feet, it would include very small businesses, but might also include restaurants, which tend to sometimes be a little bit larger than 5,000 square feet, given that they have rest or kitchen space and other things. But it wouldn't. But for instance, a supermarket or a big box store, that's going to be much larger than 10,000 square feet. We could pick a smaller number. Wherever you pick that number, there's a chance that some businesses are gonna trip above whatever that number is. So.
Through you, Madam Mayor, just to add to Jeff's comments, when we were researching different types of current craft manufacturing and also other larger users, they either were $10,000 square feet or less. So that was kind of one of our points, is gauging where kind of the larger, as Jeff said, big box versus some of our smaller kind of craft manufacturers are.
And what was a small business that would be able to qualify for, how is that defined? To get the small business exemption?
Well, in the current zoning ordinance, the exemption, it doesn't define small business. It applies to any non-residential use that requires 4 parking spaces or less. So again, that can vary quite a bit. It can be for a retail store with kind of a lower required parking ratio. It could apply to kind of a larger retail store, but for restaurants, which have a much higher parking requirement, it would have to be a much smaller restaurant to qualify for the exemption. I think the application of it has been, for that reason, has been a little confusing to business owners, and it maybe doesn't always play out the way it's intended to. But the notion here was, I think, an alternative approach, basing it on the size of the square footage of the establishment, is maybe a little bit easier to understand.
Other questions? Are you set, Jason?
Thank you.
None from Michael. Mr. Marr?
Just really briefly, I would just say that Nancy Donahue, who's with me, who is the government affairs person for the chamber, and I just met with the Retailers Association of Massachusetts. They represent about 4,000 retailers statewide. And I guess the good news, bad news is that we're not the only community struggling with these issues. It goes beyond being a statewide issue. It is countrywide. And I think that, it is good, and it's a good place to be to have this discussion. I think that what we heard is that the biggest impediment to new retailers opening in communities are regulations, and that easing and finding ways to ease those regulations are important to opening retailers, and it's also really important to keeping retailers. That many people are finding it very difficult to stay in business with overregulation by communities. So I think this is a good and timely discussion to be having. I would just add that I think that I wrote some notes here and I'm looking at it, but many of the issues, I know the issue about looking at how do you, when people come and look for advice, and I think that the problem is that many people that come looking for advice, quite honestly, they don't know where to go. So they may be asking an elected official, they may be asking a business representative, they may be asking the city or another retailer or another business operator. And the first answer should not be, go get yourself a good lawyer. And I have to be honest that is typically where I wind up saying to folks, you need to make sure you're doing this right. And I think, I can tell you, I think it's, we can all personalize this stuff, but you know, I know Jason and I, and without naming the name of the business, both went to an opening of a small business. This guy put his heart and soul into this business. It was an immigrant, spent a fortune opening the place. It did not last 12 months. And I look at that and I think, you know, that's more than a failed business. That is, you know, this person's livelihood crushed. And I think that we have to try to figure out a way that as a community we can support small business like that and really be there to kind of help them through the process. And I just add one more, you know, when we think about the multidisciplinary department approach, whether it's CDD or whether it is economic development or traffic and parking or whatever, licensing, you know, there are examples of, I think that, I'm going to say another business that was around that was a coffee shop that you could see 30-minute parking outside the coffee shop. The coffee shop's been gone for 2 years. There's a regular restaurant there, and the 30-minute parking is still there, and it shouldn't be there. And so I think sometimes we drop it with the person who they're dealing with, but we need to go back and look at parking regulations. We need to look at things beyond what the license is to open it. And I'm not sure, quite frankly, that the operator knows that they can even approach somebody from the city to say, hey, what the hell do we have this 30-minute parking outside? There's nothing. You can see a 30-minute parking outside of a dry cleaner, maybe a coffee shop, something quick that people are in and out, but not outside of a sit-down restaurant.
Those are great points. Thank you. Before I open up to public comment, does the mayor have anything to say? Oh, great. Does not. We have one person signed up for public comment. Ms. Ruth Riles, would you like to come up? And please use the mic. Oh, there's no mic up there? Please, please join us at the table.
Actually, I don't have a lot to say. I came in a little late. I wanted to make sure that I understood, and I heard you address it later, the land use requirements, the table of.
Could you please speak to the mic?
One
Sorry
of the
about that.
things we'd like.
You're welcome to sit at the table.
Up in the Porter Square area, we just we have two concerns. Obviously, there are neighbors who have one set of concerns when a business wants something on the avenue, and the other is, of course, the businesses or the lack thereof, the open, empty storefronts on the avenue. And one of our concerns was to make sure that as soon as we possibly could, there was a readdressment of the table of uses. We'd like to see the possibility of things like commercial kitchens, and in some way provide for meeting spaces in some of the larger storefronts. There's not nearly enough way for a community organization or neighbors to in fact have a place to meet. We'd love to have even things like small performances. Personally, I see no reason if you're going to have acoustic music that you couldn't have 4 or 5 people. You're just talking about a noise level, not, and I'm probably crossing over to another zoning area, which I profess I do not understand zoning, no matter how many times it is explained to me. But those were just our concerns, that there be some speed to all of this, because, and I want to address one thing, sort of as a complaint. Dennis addressed the wood fire issue. Just to drop back to what Shepherd did, they started a business. They came in with a business plan. They must have shown, and it was clearly in all of their, everything they put out, everything they said, that they were going to do this. It would have been helpful to their lives, their plans, and the cost level all around for the city and them. If somebody had looked at, maybe this isn't the greatest place to do that, which I think we can all say now, but that process should have been brought to the table well earlier. Thanks.
Thank you, Ruth, and thank you for your public comment. I think the other person signed up spoke, and so we don't. With that, I will close public comment. We have about 35 minutes left, so I wanted to. I think we had a good discussion on some of those land use issues, and I'll be doing a follow-up on these matters. But I did want to get to the second half of our program, which is the vacant storefront issue and the initiative, and hear from staff on those updates, because it seems there are many updates and there's important work that's being done and some questions that we have. So with that, toss it back to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Got a little closer. So we responded to the policy order on January 8th, but we actually have some more updates since then. So I'll just kick it off with the vacant storefront design contest. We received over 430 submissions from as far away as California, although the majority of them are from the area. And the youngest submission was from a 4-year-old, which I want to give an honorable mention to and put somewhere. And then, and with the oldest individual applying 90 years old. So, you know, we have a good demographic of people, and the internal panel will be meeting this week to discuss the submissions. We'll also open a People Choice survey on February 18th, and people can vote online or at 344 Broadway. So we're really excited with just the amount of submissions that we received for that. So more on that soon. And Pardis is going to talk a little bit about our Cambridge Vacant Storefront database, and we now have a map, and it's online. And I'll let her share that.
Through you, Madam Chair. So as you can see, we've used the GIS story map to provide a vacant storefront database. This is public now, and it will hopefully soon, by the end of the day, be on the CDD website, on our Vacant Storefront Initiative website. But as you can see, we've mapped it out. So green means, and this is obviously when you get into more detail, you'll be able to see it, but green means vacancies that are pretty much less than 10 months, even less than that. Blue is those vacancies that are about 1 to 2 years, and then red are those very longer, consistent vacancies that we've seen 2+ years. So now we have a visual kind of guide to go along with the paper version of the Vacant Storefront database. Similar to the paper version, we will update this on a quarterly basis, but this was last updated February 2nd. And so when you go through this, if you click on a point, you will see the property owner, when we have it available. We do have the square footage available, and also who to contact if you are interested in the space itself.
And I wanted to offer just some more information, because when we talked in September, we wanted to, you know, basically go back and try to do some additional research. So I'm going to provide some of that now. So as early as February 2019, we have approximately 50 ground floor retail vacancies. I think we had about 51 in December. And this includes the following types of vacancies, which are buildings under redevelopment, and about, I think it's 6 to 8%, because this doesn't add up to 100. Spaces where a tenant has signed a letter of intent and is going through lease negotiations is about 18% of the vacancies. And spaces that are indeed fully vacant, which is about 76% to our knowledge. And then additionally, there are other spaces where a lease has been signed, but business is going through construction and permitting process, which takes some time. And we've actually taken those out of the database because they are in the process of moving in. And then over the past quarter, the most vacancies have been found in Harvard Square, with about a total of 14 spaces vacant out of that 50. And then the breakdown by ownership entity, which I think we'd been asked by council, which is about 18 of the 50, or 36%, are REITs, real estate investment trusts. 22 or 44% are trusts. 6 or 12% are condos or unknown entities, and 2 or 4% are individuals. that breakdown of ownership entity. And I think in regard to Councilor Siddiqui's question about how long some of the 2-year vacancies have been, very long term. And I think, do we have a number on the? Yeah. And that's on the database.
So through you, Madam Chair, approximately in East Cambridge, Inman Square, we have about 3, which we consider kind of the longer term, so 4+ years. I can give specific addresses if you'd like, but that's looking at 1055 Cambridge Street, which is where Universal Monument used to be, and that is going through, I believe, approval for a new residential mixed-use building. 465 Cambridge Street, part of it is currently occupied by a retail tenant, but another part is not. That's where Sulo Fabrics used to be. And then 1287 Cambridge Street, which is where Sandy's Market used to be, which I know we've heard some local rumors that it might be hopefully leased soon. In Central Square, there's 2 that have kind of that 4+ vacancy in and out. One is 541 Mass Ave, the old Out of the Blue Gallery or Blockbuster, which is soon to be a medical marijuana dispensary. 675 Mass Ave and / Prospect Street. It's the whole building, the ground floor, I should say, was where CCTV used to be, and also the T-Mobile store. In Harvard Square, it's 10 Church Street, which is the old theater that, as many of you know, is up for redevelopment. And then in Porter Square, we have 3. One is the Evergood Market, which is 1674 Mass Ave, the old Roach Sporting Goods store, or it used to be a CrossFit as well, at 1957 Mass Ave. And then the newer Rand Building development at 1965 Mass Ave, which again, we've also heard possible leasing coming soon. And then in our smaller districts, where Poor Little Rich Girl once stood at 121 Hampshire Street also qualifies for 4+ years of being vacant.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think some of the other questions that we heard from council were about issues around like the district level vacancies. And so I would say mostly in Harvard Square and Lower Mass Ave, there were a lot of zoning hurdles that people ran into. And basically citywide licensing and permitting were noted as an issue. And then tax write-off, the use of vacancies as a tax write-off was mostly noted for REITs, which I don't think was a real big surprise for us. But and then high asking rents in areas such as Harvard Square, which we've noted has a much higher rent rate than anywhere else in the city. And then in some cases that disinterested owner or leasing agent, where they're just not really interested in leasing it and don't necessarily care about the activity of the building itself. And we're finding that maybe in some of the smaller districts in Porter and Lower Mass Ave and East Cambridge.
Thank you. And I believe I'd asked for some of this additional data in early January when he had them. I think it was the January 14th meeting, so it was less than a month ago. So I appreciate you getting us that information. For those of us not GIS savvy, is it possible to, and I can make a request, but to have this somewhere that we can just go to, where I know it's ever changing, but just the recent stats that you've just told us about, it'd be helpful to just get that information.
Yes, most of this information is available on the vacant storefront database, but the breakouts we did, and we're happy to.
Yeah. That, I'm glad it's. I've been looking at it. It's updated, so thank you for that. I think, I have some ideas on how to maybe make it. I like this database. I think we can make it in a way that we can have some of these additional categories that would be helpful, because often as councilors were asked, why did this place close? Why did this place close? And if we know, in Harvard Square, that place, that was a tax write-off, it'd be easy to just point to that and people to look at that. So that'd be helpful moving forward, and we're happy for the committee to formally ask you that. I will ask my colleagues if they have some questions. The mayor?
Thank you. I actually just wanted to follow up on that. I was thinking a similar thing. You had mentioned that in the database you had taken out certain empty storefronts because they're kind of in this funky position of, they're sort of in process, but, the person walking down the street has no idea of knowing that, right? So all they see is an empty storefront, and don't know why. So maybe including them in some other section or some other way that people can see that, I think is helpful, for the public. And also, I think, as Councilor Siddiqui said, I mean, there's that small percentage that might be doing this for, a tax write-off or what have you. But it sounds like the majority are not for those reasons. But I think without explanation, people tend to jump to the worst conclusion, right? And so there's probably a lot of businesses that, are having other obstacles or landowners that are having other obstacles of getting businesses in there, but somehow they're, people are assuming it's because they're just holding out for whatever. So it's not fair to them either if they're kind of lumped into that category. But going back, I don't know, Councilor Carlone, was it 4 years ago plus, where Councilor Carlone and I put in an ordinance around empty storefronts and looking at fines for storefronts that were left vacant for extended periods of time, and I know that got complicated, and there was a lot of talk of, well, there's different reasons, and there are lease issues, and this, that, and the other thing. But some of these storefronts that are 2+ years, I think that's in a different category. That's and so where are we? Is that then we refiled it, I think, more recently, and haven't heard. Is that just? Should I assume that the silence on that is that it's dead in the water and people aren't interested in going that route, or is it still being talked about? Or, because I tend to think that for some of these folks, unfortunately, you don't get their attention until you hit them in the pocketbook, right? And so we can have all kinds of motivating contests and all kinds of things, and I think that's good, and I think you get people who are interested in doing things that way to take part. But you also get, I think of Uno's restaurant that's sitting in the middle of Harvard Square, that's basically sitting there because they're trying to get a ridiculous amount of money in rent, and they can sit there all day, forever, because it's a good investment, right? So how do we, at some point we need to say that's not okay. And so where are we with that? Is there any interest in that, or are we just not going that way?
I completely concur with the mayor on this. I think in September and then June before that, and then I think in February, we heard back from CDD on this vacant storefront best practices report. And so we got this report back on the different measures some cities and communities have taken. And I think, from my recollection, in September and then prior June, in September we discussed some of these, and I think the consensus, and my colleagues on the committee can jump in and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think it was that I think many of us, as a policy perspective, many of us are in favor of looking at those particular, I don't know what the best word is, but these institutional kind of investors who are leaving their storefront properties really vacant. And it seemed that, we never put it off the table. I think it's not off the table. I think the recommendation from the report just said these are the recommendations. We don't know how effective these regulations are. And so, we're definitely in favor of it. I think, again, it's a capacity issue, and it's also, from what I heard from Herdis in the fall, we're going to try to communicate with these property owners, try to get as much information as possible, and then we'll see what next steps are. But so correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's where we're at. I think it's TBD, and I think, but as the mayor said, I think all of us really want to look at those particular problem child.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair, and I really appreciate you kind of going and helping us through the timeline, because we did want to, we did talk in September and say, you know, let us try to look at this entire universe of vacancies and try to figure out a little bit more about some of the nuance that's going on, because we wouldn't know until we talked to the property owners, you know, who was actually in the process of trying to lease and who was maybe stuck in a variance process or a special permit process and couldn't get, you know, quite get through, you know, versus, or, you know, was having trouble with build out or something like that, because that happens a lot. And it just, you know, but they look vacant. And so we can have those conversations. I believe that there's a non-awaiting report that we're happy to answer, you know, and work with the law department on, you know, drafting a potential ordinance. You know, not to ride on the train, Jeff's train, but to say, you know, there is capacity, because we are going to be, you know, trying to get put forth the cannabis business permitting social equity ordinance soon too. You know, but it's certainly something that we want to look at, and we would definitely want council's guidance on some of the policy issues. You know, do we have, and I think Pardis and I have talked about this recently, is do we want to have everybody file, you know, everybody who's vacant, no matter how long, or maybe, you know, somebody who's between that, you know, 6 months, because 6 months is usually how long it takes to actually get a place leased and through the process, and anybody over 6 months, have them be, you know, file as part of this ordinance. And then, you know, over a certain period of time, you know, whether it's a year or 18 months, you have to activate your storefront in this manner, and then past a certain point, you have to pay the fine, excuse me, which I think maxes out at $300 a day under statute. You know, but if, say, a large organization or somebody some of these properties have been sitting vacant for 4 years and not activated, $300 a day at $9,000 a month starts to hurt a little bit, you know, for some of them anyway. So, and seeing if that can affect a change and being able to, you know, provide those measurable measurable metrics, I should say, you know, but certainly looking to council to help us through that policy guidance.
Great, and I'm happy to have another hearing on the matter. We have less than 20 minutes left, but I think this is something that I'm glad recently has been discussed. Questions? Councilor Mallon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you. I was just looking through the storefront vacancies best practices from June of last year and thinking about this exact issue and how to, I think when I think about assessing levies or fines on vacant property owners, I think it's important to make a distinction or some kind of financial distinction between the, you know, institutional investors or large commercial developers versus a mom and pop shop in East Cambridge or in Inman Square who can't rent their retail store because they can't afford to upgrade their ADA requirements or any other number of things that, you know, it's actually cheaper for them to not rent it than to make these changes. So I just want to call out, I know that Councilor Siddiqui just pointed out that in a lot of places that have these type of taxes or levies or fees, we don't really know if they're working. But in Washington, D.C., they seem to have a really good program, which actually, you know, is a tax rate per $100. So, you know, that kind of goes to the mom and pop thing versus the large. So, you know, somebody who has 10,000 or I don't know how many square feet the Uno's is, but that's a huge piece. And if $300 a day is one thing, but you know, if you're taxing $10 a square foot and then taxing somebody in East Cambridge, you know, 85 cents a square foot, I think it kind of can delineate between, you know, the small mom and pop and then the larger investor class. So I look forward to having another conversation about this particular issue. I think it's something that we would all like to really dig our teeth into. Just going back to the GIS mapping, which I also am not an expert in, but that's fine, right? We're not experts, it's okay. One of the questions I had was, when you click into a vacant storefront, does it tell you which businesses, what district it's in, what the zoning, because one of the best practices from Larissa Ortiz was the bostonzoningcheck.com, and I think having sort of that information and access, like knowing what the storefront is, knowing what the zoning is right there, if you're somebody who's looking, you would have all that information. It goes back to that knowledge is power that Ms. Musgrave was talking about in terms of starting off on the right foot and knowing exactly, not even going to see a place if you know exactly what you're allowed to have in there. So I didn't know if there was any sort of interplay or interface that we could do with this bostonzoningcheck.com idea in that GIS mapping to have more information available to potential renters.
Through you, Madam Chair, the map doesn't have the zoning, like what, district they're in, but we can definitely easily add that to it. Like I said, it does have, how much square footage is available, the ownership, so if they are interested in the space, they know who to contact, but we can definitely add what zoning district they're in.
I think that would be helpful, and, were you going to say something? I think that would be helpful and really looking at this bostonzoningcheck.com and see if there's something that similar that we can do here in Cambridge, especially if we're rolling out a new table of uses or updated table of uses. I think it would be really, really helpful to have something like this. So thank you.
Councillor Carlone?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I concur. I think that's a great idea to correlate it to what's possible, or even if neighborhoods say these are the uses we'd love to see. I know that's extra work, but that would be wonderful. I also concur with fines. I think it should be frontage as the guide, and maybe it is square footage for deep sites, but I can think of a storefront site on the corner that its impact is very dramatic because it's on the corner. And the other thing I wanted to mention, I couldn't get to the map site. I went to your vacant storefront initiative, and maybe that's coming, that there'll be a link. Thank you. You don't have to answer then. Because I found the map very useful seeing it on the screen. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Zonovan?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you, back to this very popular database that is soon to be coming. Is it downloadable?
Through you, Madam Chair, the current Word version of the database is downloadable. It's a PDF format, and then we've added into this new virtual map so that you can click through the map and particularly look at a space. So very, hopefully low tech for the user, but they can go through the city map and see if there's a space they're interested in. And then again, there's a PDF version as well.
Great, thanks. But the PDF is a map or it's a table?
It is just a table at this time.
This is what it looks like.
Okay, great. So I mean, it would be ideal if there was a like a spreadsheet format that we could download, but that's not required because we can convert the PDF. And then is it longitudinal? So in other words, when you update it, do you erase the old information or does it continue to track old information?
Through you, Madam Chair, we keep online the most updated quarter version, but we do have the historical data if someone was interested in it.
Thanks. That'll be very helpful if we could download the historical data as well.
Yep, we can definitely do that.
Thanks. Madam Chair, were you planning to make a motion on some of the things that we'd be asking for from a policy perspective?
I was going to write it up and submit it.
After the fact?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Do my colleagues have any additional questions? So I do see Ruth's hand up. Would you like to come to the table and ask your question?
One other thing occurs to me because we've seen it happen a couple times up our way. There's that period of time when somebody buys a property, a commercial property, and the leases run out and somebody's kicked out or a business is changed over. A good example is Rodney and their capital partner owned the whole space there that Walk and Roll was in. And I got caught in trying to negotiate, this was sort of funny actually, between the Thai and the Chinese in terms of why this old and beloved Walk and Roll was going to have to go and that their rent was going to go up like 5 times or something. And the Rodney making the very also understandable argument that they'd let them sit there for 5 years at the old rent and never raised it, and he never raised his prices or in any way. What I'm getting to, and the same thing is occurring where PaperSource sits, and now there's an ad that the whole property there is going to be, or is potentially up for rezoning and building out. But people, the employees at PaperSource don't know anything at the moment. That's right in Porter Square. What I'm getting to is there not a role for the city when there's a change in ownership to step in or at least be available to help negotiate? Is there a way for the existing business to stay there by being a little bit more savvy, raising their prices, doing whatever is required, maybe reducing their space? Or maybe in something like the PaperSource situation, and I actually tried it with the Walk and Roll, is there another place they could go that's, you know, convenient to their timing and their space and their pricing? The Walk and Roll gentleman had only 5 years to go before he retired, so he wasn't really anxious to do a big opening of anything else. So that came to nothing. But I think there's a role for the city to help keep those businesses in the neighborhood.
Thank you, and thank you for the question. Councillor Mallon?
I had a quick question. It's not a follow-up to that, but can I?
Sure. We have the questions on record, and we can have a further discussion about that. Councillor Mallon.
Thank you. And Ruth, thank you. I think those are great ideas. Thank you for pointing them out. I had a question that we didn't talk about, the vacant storefront artwork contest, and when those, I think I saw something that they're going to be announced soon, or there's finalists. Can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Through you, Madam Chair. Applications were due on Friday of last week. As Lisa mentioned, we received over 400 submissions. And this week, we, with the jury, are going to choose semifinalists. Then starting next week, online as well as at the Annex, 344 Broadway, people can come in and vote or vote online for the finalists. And then soon in early March, we will announce the finalists and hopefully be able to line up some property owners who will display the artwork.
So there'll just be one artwork for people to choose from?
Through you, Madam Chair. No, actually, we're hoping to have 12 to 15 semifinalists, and then out of those semifinalists, 5 will be chosen as the finalists.
Oh, that's great. I can't wait to see those. Thank you for doing that.
I'm looking forward to that as well. Ms. Musgrave.
One quick question. It was just addressed earlier. Lisa, you had mentioned a lot of really interesting stats, and I couldn't take notes. But are those also on the stats that you just highlighted? Will those be on the vacant storefront website, or where would we find those?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, we're going to detail out a little bit more of this information and make sure it's included on the vacant storefront project page.
Okay, great. Yeah. And then just one more comment, if you, as has been said, just for Cambridge Local First to go on the record, we also would appreciate some kind of a structured system that you delineated with a fine for larger businesses that, in particular, keep their stores open for many, many years. We feel like that is a structural change that would really help to enliven our streetscape, that really helps our local businesses because it brings more people there as well, and also residents are really keen on that too. And so that's something that we would like to explore and continue moving forward on addressing this issue, that we have a lot of marquee locations or concentrations of areas where there's a lot of vacancies. So there's been a lot of good movement with the artwork, and the zoning effort is a big piece and will contribute to that. But I think there's if we could just continue to, and I guess I asked council as well, to keep continuing to push for structural work to happen, policy work to happen. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And in the 5 minutes we have left, I wanted to I had a question about the week, Small Business Week that's coming up in May. And I've been thinking a lot about legacy businesses and businesses that have been around in our city for many, many years, and doing something to celebrate those businesses. I'm familiar with the San Francisco Planning Department and the kind of the initiatives that they do. Theirs are much more complex and involve, money and so forth. But I've just been thinking about that, and I'd love to see the schedule when you have it, and I'd love to think about ways that we can honor some of the legacy businesses that are in our city. Thanks.
Through you, Madam Chair, just a brief overview off the top of my head about what we're doing. So our goal is to, it's May 5th through the 11th, so that Sunday is in Mayfair. And then we'll be continuing on with doing some events on Monday, including a permitting event. So as many of you know, the city is going to a lot of online permitting. So it'll be an opportunity for people to come in and talk to DPW, ISD, and other departments about questions they may have about permitting. We'll also be hosting our local vendor fair, which the city as well as other top 25 employers will be coming in to talk to smaller business owners who are interested in vending with them. In the city in particular, the purchasing department is taking up the lead on doing a quick seminar about how they, you can apply to become a vendor, and also what the city often looks for when looking for vendors for different services and supplies. We are also doing some panels on different discussions, one around like succession planning. We also have we're doing our open house in Huron Village, and we're hoping to end the event, or kind of the week, I should say, with a pedestrian walk of Lower Mass Ave and North Mass Ave, with some help with the pedestrian committee at CDD, to encourage people to get to know their business owners and enjoy the avenue.
Great, thank you. I look forward to talking more about that week. Adrian.
We also care a lot about our local legacy businesses here, and we have a lot of thoughts on how we can do that, and we asked Pardis to actually pull some data from the city on what are our local legacy businesses, and she has a phenomenal list that she's pulled together. And just this morning at our board, we talked about ways to do that as well. And I know that our other business associations would like to do something also. So this is something that's top on our minds, and look forward to talking more about it. But I just wanted to say that Pardis had a great list to kick it off.
That's awesome. Well, with that, it is 1:58, and I will close the meeting. I got the agenda. Thank you, everyone, for coming and taking the time to talk about this very important topic, and I look forward to future discussions. Thank you.
know. God, I can't wait. I'm all done. I'm already all done. Lisa, so March.
Yeah.
It's not bleak because of like, I mean, honestly, because of climate change, winter getting colder, like it's pushing this. It's a CBD.
I know, 'cause it's like, was it last year? Christina says, "Oh, how do you feel about March? You feel on March?" And I was like, "I do nothing March. I'm neutral March because March is usually just New York." And that the week later, we got dumped on and knocked over all the trees. That's when I couldn't come in because it was literally couldn't get out of my driveway because there were like wires knocked down on both sides of the road.
Yeah, Wednesday, 26th.
Where is
She
it?
didn't have a house. It was like literally.
Okay. Yeah. See, that's what
Cold shower
isn't happening.
and then flaring my hair in Home Depot. And nobody said anything because everybody was still empowering. I was like, oh yeah, I'm okay.
He hears me. I'm like, what is this? Yeah, right? Like, what? Oh, yeah. All right, let me know how you're. Yeah,